competition with other great powers who are vying for control over international order should push policymakers to be more sensitive to how their actions are perceived. It is possible, depending on the grand strategy America adopts, that those considerations are seen as less salient. So a true America First foreign policy might be less sensitive to those costs, but then again, it might also be less interventionist, at least on paper. But the Trump administration, like all administrations, is complicated. And so I think policymakers will have to wrestle with the optics of their actions more than they have for the last 30 years.
Good evening. Hi, everybody. My name is Ryan Morehard, and I'm on the World Boston Board, and I'm very happy to have everyone here today. I'm very happy to turn to our tonight's great decisions topic on American foreign policy at a crossroads. We know, as we sit here, that the global landscape continues to evolve, and each of us is asking pivotal questions about America's future on the world stage and how American foreign policy can adapt to meet that new era. And fortunately, tonight we have someone with us who's exceptionally qualified to guide us through those questions. We have Michael Poznansky here. Thank you, Michael. So, Michael is a professor of international relations and author of Great Power, Great Responsibility: How the Liberal International Order Shapes U.S. Foreign Policy, and also the author of In the Shadow of International Law, Secrecy and Regime Change in the Post-War World. Michael was previously an assistant professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and his work has appeared in the American Journal of Political Science, International Studies Quarterly, Journal of Treaty Studies, Security Studies, and War on the Rocks, among very many other places. So we are very happy to welcome Michael tonight. Michael, please take the stage. And we'll wrap up. After Michael's presentation, we'll be doing some Q&A. We'll be looking forward to hearing from each of you. So please have your questions in mind. So welcome, Michael.
First and foremost, I want to thank World Boston for having me, for putting this on, for you all for coming out. Special thanks to Harrison. Congratulations to Sarah, the new president of World Boston. It's a pleasure to be here. Oh yeah, please. That is worthy of a round of applause. The vague title here. I'll give my obligatory disclaimer that I'm here in my personal capacity and that my views are my own and don't represent those of the Naval War College or any other government entity. So in the next 20, 25 minutes or so, I want to make three main arguments about our topic tonight. The first is that while charting a solid course for the future of American foreign policy ideally requires that we anticipate the future to some extent, this is an uphill climb. Second, when it comes to the question of what America's role in the world should be, the consensus view is under enormous strain, but that is not necessarily unique to our moment. And there are many possible paths the U.S. might take, some of which are further or closer together than it might otherwise seem. And third and finally, there are some big challenges ahead, so we better get to work to figure this out. So first, on anticipating the future. Early on in the George W. Bush administration, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld sent the president a short memo. The subject was predicting the future. Rumsfeld told the president, quote, "I ran across this piece on the difficulty of predicting the future, thought you might find it interesting." At the time, this is 2001, the administration was preparing its quadrennial defense review, which is a fancy name for this document that at the time Congress mandated the Pentagon produce to guide what kind of resources and strategies they would be investing in to achieve their mission in the near future. The memo Rumsfeld was referring to was written by a staffer at the Pentagon named Linton Wells, and it was meant to inform that conversation. In the span of a single page, Wells ticks through the entirety of the 20th century in increments of 10 years, each bullet point reflecting the enormity of change that had occurred within the span of just a decade. And I must confess, I actually don't think I've seen a more effective one-pager in my entire life. I've thought about this memo since the time I read it. You can go ahead and Google it afterwards if you want to have a look. But if you'll indulge me for a moment, I want to give you a flavor of what's in this memo on predicting the future. If you had been a security policymaker in the world's greatest power in 1900, Wells wrote, you would have been a Brit, looking warily at your age-old enemy, France. By 1910, you'd be allied with France, and your enemy would be Germany. By 1920, World War I would have been fought and won, and you'd be engaged in a naval arms race with your erstwhile allies, the US and Japan. I'm not going to bore you, I promise, with the entirety of the document. So here's the gist of the rest quickly, because I think it's worth ticking through. By 1930, the world is in a Great Depression. 9 years later, World War II is underway. By 1950, it's over, and the atomic age is born with the advent of nuclear weapons. The US is at war in Korea. In 1960, few people had heard of Vietnam, and 10 years later, the peak of American involvement there was waning, and the US forged détente, or a warming of relations with the Soviet Union. In 1980, 10 years later, the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Iran experienced its revolution. 10 years after that, 1990, the Berlin Wall is gone. Revolution is spreading across Europe. I'm cheating a little bit here, but in 91, the US and Soviet Union worked together for the first time in the entire post-war UN system in a collective military action to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. And later that year in 1991, the Soviet Union is gone. By the year 2000, Germany and Poland are both in NATO. Perhaps the best part of Wells' memo, in my view, is the way that he ends it. After this incredible list I've just paraphrased, he writes, quote, all of which is to say, I'm not sure what 2010 will look like, but I'm sure that it will be very little like we expect, so we should plan accordingly. It's worth reflecting on the fact, I think, that Wells wrote this memo on April 12th, 2001. 5 months later, the US suffers the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil in its history. It turns out that Wells was right. The future was little like they expected. The reason I've spent so much time on this Wells memo is that it has incredible salience for one of the key issues the organizers put before us for this series. What are the decisions, risks, and opportunities that lie ahead in an increasingly tumultuous international landscape? I believe that what the Wells memo shows us clearly is that unpredictability, far from being a unique feature of the age we're living in, is a staple of international politics and probably politics more generally. And to really drive this point home, let's imagine what it would look like if Wells wrote his memo for the 21st century. Let's use 2001 as our baseline, the year Wells left off. And it might go something like this. So this is my poor attempt to replicate what Wells was doing. By 2010, so starting in 2001, by 2010, the US would have launched 2 wars, one in Afghanistan, one in Iraq, experienced a Great Recession, and elected the first Black president in American history. By 2020, the US is out of Iraq. Revolution in the Middle East, the so-called Arab Spring, has come and gone. China experienced a meteoric rise, and a real estate mogul and TV star was elected president. Within 5 years, our current year, for those of you following along, the US is out of Afghanistan. Israel suffers a horrific terrorist attack and launches a devastating war in Gaza. Russia invades Ukraine. A ragtag rebel group called the Houthis brought international shipping to a stop in the Red Sea. Joe Biden's presidency came and went, and Donald Trump returned to the White House for a second term. And of course, within the span of 5 years, we went from very few people having any semblance of an idea of what large language models were to everybody having it in their pocket. The lesson from all of this is simple enough. Prediction is hard, really hard, but there's just one little problem. Policymakers don't have the luxury of throwing up their hands and subjecting the fate of the nation to chance. They have to make decisions and investments now to prepare for an uncertain world, always with the recognition that what they choose could end up being wrong. Which leads to the second question I want to address tonight. What should America's role be in a highly unpredictable world? Rather than being purely reactive to events, our leaders and our country need a vision that clearly states what America's core interests and values are, and to, of course, be flexible and adaptable when the world inevitably surprises us. So when it comes to the question of what America's role in the world should be, there is actually a conventional wisdom, or at least a long-standing consensus view, and it goes like this. The U.S. should continue to be what it has been for the last 80 years, and that is the leader of what is known as the rules-based international order. What exactly the rules-based international order is tricky to pin down and can have a you-know-it-when-you-see-it type feel. When the U.S. and global allies helped Ukraine defend itself against an unprovoked and illegal invasion by Russia in early 22, that is, for many observers, a clear example of the rules-based international order in action. Russia crossed a red line. You don't rewrite borders at the point of a gun. And the U.S. marshaled the international community to help the victim, Ukraine, resist Vladimir Putin's aggression. When the U.S. sent naval assets into the Red Sea in an effort to combat the Houthis that were threatening international shipping, that's also seen as a clear example of the rules-based international order for many observers. The U.S., in its role as an international leader, was protecting global commerce and the free flow of goods. In reality, the rules-based international order is not actually a single thing, it's a collection of things. It is the United Nations and NATO. It's the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Trade Organization. The rules-based international order is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. In other words, it captures this global system, the institutions, the rules, the norms that the U.S. helped establish in the rubble of World War II, with the aim of bringing stability and predictability to the international system. According to advocates or proponents of the rules-based international order, the U.S. didn't set this system up out of the goodness of its heart. To the contrary, they argue that post-war leaders, so think FDR, Harry Truman, their advisors, did it because it was in America's interests to do so. By giving other states a stake in the international system, they helped give legitimacy to the order. They also gave legitimacy to the order by promising that the United States would follow the very rules and norms it was setting out for others. And of course, all of this is happening as leaders are thinking about ways to reduce the chances of another world war and to compete with what was then America's chief rival, the Soviet Union. Notwithstanding its apparent successes, the rules-based international order has faced its share of challenges, especially in recent years. These challenges have led to a reckoning and a big public debate about whether the role the United States has played for 8 decades is fit for purpose in today's world. For starters, the rules-based international order never fully grappled with how deepening globalization and ever-expanding free trade would impact domestic sectors in the United States. Manufacturing has taken an especially heavy hit over the years as other countries produced more goods for cheaper in an interconnected and globalized economy. As people struggled economically, the value proposition of sending money overseas, even for good causes, didn't line up for many people. It's a truism in the foreign policy and foreign aid community that the amount the U.S. spends on foreign aid is far less than people actually think it is. In 2024, last year, soon to be 2 years ago, the U.S. spent roughly $15.3 billion on humanitarian assistance and $13.2 billion on global health. That is 0.41% of the total 2024 budget, which was $6.8 trillion. And yet, that is just not how many people saw it. More broadly, decision makers, bipartisan, didn't always tell a compelling story about why what happened overseas mattered to Americans. For the greatest generation, this was clear enough. Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan weren't just Europe's problem or Asia's problem, they were America's problem. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union posed a challenge to the US on a global scale, including in the Western Hemisphere. But as those threats receded in the 1990s and 2000s, and the US stood alone as the world's sole superpower, shouldering the burden for security in places like Europe, Asia, and elsewhere made less and less sense for a lot of people. This is, in many ways, the starting point for America First, a big challenge to the rules-based international order. In his confirmation hearing to become Secretary of State, Marco Rubio argued that while the global order created after World War II, quote, served us well, the way it manifested over the last 30 years has not, he argues. Here in America, Rubio stated, and in many of the advanced economies across the world, an almost religious commitment to free and unfettered trade at the expense of our national economy shrunk the middle class, left the working class in crisis, collapsed industrial capacity, and pushed critical supply chains into the hands of adversaries and rivals. He went on to argue that, quote, while America far too often continued to prioritize the global order above our core national interests, other nations continue to act the way countries always have and always will, in what they perceive to be in their best interest. Just last week, this is a pretty savvy crowd, I'm sure, so you might have seen that the Trump administration released its national security strategy, a document that every administration puts out every 4 years to outline their vision for global affairs. It echoes similar themes to Rubio's confirmation. After the end of the Cold War, it argues American foreign policy elites convinced themselves that permanent American domination of the entire world was in the best interest of our country. Yet the affairs of other countries are our concern only if their activities directly threaten our interests, end quote. This thinking presents a dramatically different view of what role the U.S. should play than the consensus that has guided Washington for the better part of 8 decades since the end of World War II. If the logic of the rules-based international order is that the U.S. should sometimes give up short-term gain and leverage in the hopes of achieving longer-term benefits, America First takes the opposite view, namely that the U.S. has all of this untapped potential and power and leverage that previous presidents have been reluctant to use, to the detriment of the United States. There is no question America First is a major departure from the consensus view, but it's not the first time that U.S. leaders have grappled with the rules-based international order and questioned its conventional wisdom. Richard Haas, who was then serving in the State Department of the Bush 43 administration and would go on to serve as the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, said in July of 2001 that, quote, what you're going to get from this administration is a la carte multilateralism. He went on to say, we'll look at each agreement and make a decision rather than come up with our own broad-based approach. Early on in his presidency, George W. Bush declared that the U.S. wouldn't adhere to the Kyoto Protocol, a landmark environmental agreement, because of his fear that it would negatively impact the U.S. economy through higher energy prices. This argument, is worth pointing out, shares some affinities with Trump's rationale for withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords in his first term. In December 2001, President Bush announced that the U.S. was withdrawing from the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia due to the belief that, quote, it hinders our government's ability to develop ways to protect our people from future terrorist or rogue state missile attacks, end quote. What each of these arguments boils down to, and I'm not here to advocate for one or the other, I would love to hear your thoughts and have a conversation, is whether disagreements about whether robust, principled global engagement serve the interests of the American people, or whether it needlessly constrains the U.S., putting the world's interests ahead of our own. I think that fundamentally distills the big debate happening right now in foreign policy circles. But even that characterization, which is fairly common in debates about U.S. grand strategy, is a little bit too simplistic and somewhat misleading. Even at the height of the rules-based international order, leaders often pursued policies that conflicted with its rules and norms when they thought core interests for the United States were at stake and required it. Sometimes they tried to hide those violations, other times they didn't. And Donald Trump, the chief proponent of America First, has undertaken an ambitious effort to end wars across the globe and authorize counterproliferation strikes in Iran. In an interview, I drive to and from Newport a lot, so I have a lot of time for podcasts. I listened to his interview with Dasha Burns at Politico. I don't know if any of you heard that, but he said the following when basically addressing the criticism that he's focused too much on global affairs at the expense of domestic issues in the U.S. And he said, quote, some people would say, don't focus on anything outside our border. I like that too. And he went on to say that When he calls global leaders, he, quote, thinks these are worthy phone calls, even if they didn't impact us to save millions of lives from another country. If I can do that easily, or even if they didn't impact us, sorry, to save lives from another country, if I can do that easily, I have the ability, and that's good. So those words and actions also seem to signal a real interest in certain forms of US leadership abroad. Okay, so I've just told you the world is complicated and that people disagree about the path forward. I know you are shocked. So what we really want to know is whether there is a strategy that exists that, despite its complexities, is well suited to confront the major challenges we either know are here or can see on the horizon. And for that, I think we first want to sketch out briefly, this is the third and final section, I promise, what the major challenges are. There are many. The World Economic Forum, held annually in Davos, if any of you have a connection, I'll be right out there after the talks tonight, asks respondents to identify the top risks and challenges they see as most pressing in the next 2 years. The most recent top 10 will not surprise anyone in this room. Mis and disinformation, extreme weather, societal polarization, cyber insecurity, armed conflict, lack of economic opportunity, inflation, involuntary migration, economic downturn and pollution. It's a very optimistic, cheery list. The broader 10-year list also includes things like adverse outcomes from AI and natural resource shortages. One of the most pressing geopolitical challenges for the United States, of course, is the rise of China. China has experienced unprecedented growth economically and militarily over the last few decades. By some metrics, GDP, purchasing power parity, its economy is already bigger than that of the United States. China has dramatically modernized and built up its military and military footprint, building aircraft carriers, huge numbers of missiles, offensive cyber capabilities, among many other things, and it's modernizing and expanding its nuclear arsenal. The concern from the vantage point of many in the US is that China, especially under the leadership of Xi Jinping since 2012, will displace the United States from Asia, where it has core treaty allies like Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, military bases, an enormous amount of economic activity, and where concerns over a potential conflict over Taiwan or in the South China Sea are ever present. There are, of course, other geopolitical challenges in virtually all other regions of the world. With these challenges loosely sketched out, the million-dollar question is whether one vision of America's global role is better suited to address it than others. Is the rules-based international order best poised to address the pressing challenges of our time? Is it America first? Perhaps it's another grand strategy altogether. And I haven't touched on many of those, but there are lots you might want to talk about. There's progressivism, there's conservative internationalism, there's something called deep engagement, which is kind of like the rules-based order, but with less rules and fewer rules and norms. Part of the immediate issue we run into when trying to address that question, though, is there isn't agreement on all of the challenges I've mentioned in terms of whether they are America's problem. Proponents of the rules-based order tend to take an expansive view of what constitutes a threat to U.S. national security, and America First obviously takes a narrower view. But even when there is agreement on a particular challenge that poses a risk to the United States, think China, AI, and so on, there may be disagreement about how best to approach it. How important is multilateralism for solving America's challenges? Is it better that the United States tackle solutions on its own, or should it do so in consultation with allies? And where and when is either strategy most appropriate? These are hard questions to answer. Like a good academic, I haven't given you any answers yet, but I've hopefully put some things on the table for us to talk about, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions on the issues before us and the path ahead. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was wonderful. So I know we have some time now for questions and answers. We have some runners. You'll see them on the side who are able to bring a microphone to you. Would love to take some questions. And of course, we'll make the runner come all the way down the stairs here to Ava, our green room scholar.
Hi. Yeah, I'm Eva. I'm a green room scholar for this event. In your book, In the Shadow of International Law, you argue that the enshrinement of non-intervention in international law pushed a lot of global powers to pursue covert over overt operations, especially during the Cold War. How do you think America's foreign policy right now fits into that?
Unsurprisingly, an excellent question. Thank you, Eva. Yeah, so the premise of the first book that Eva very kindly alluded to is that after World War II, in the UN Charter and elsewhere, there was the emergence of this non-intervention principle that was codified in international law, and that one of the consequences of that, and America agreeing to abide by it, was actually an uptick in the use of covert action and secrecy as policymakers tried to conceal violations of the non-intervention principle. So it was a constraint, but an imperfect one. And Eva's question is how this manifests today. I think that structurally, my sense is that competition with China and Russia, in other words, competition over international orders. So I'm mostly focused on what's happening inside the United States, our debate about what we should do, the United States, globally and in the world. But irrespective of what we choose, there is a broader debate happening, a broader competition happening, especially with China and maybe to a lesser degree Russia and others, about what the future of the international system should look like and what America's role will be and what China's role will be. So structurally, the incentives, I think, are that competition with other great powers who are vying for control over international order should push policymakers to be more sensitive to how their actions are perceived. It is possible, depending on the grand strategy America adopts, that those considerations are seen as less salient. So a true America First foreign policy might be less sensitive to those costs, but then again, it might also be less interventionist, at least on paper. But the Trump administration, like all administrations, is complicated. And so I think policymakers will have to wrestle with the optics of their actions more than they have for the last 30 years.
My name is Martin Rutter. I live in the Back Bay. I'd like to challenge you a bit about the business of predicting the future, because it seems to me, and that has always been one of the things that struck me about many people in the United States, we're going to make the future. And what concerns me at the moment, among many other things, is the Chinese have clearly, in many important respects, invested and made an effort over decades to make the future. They dominate clean energy technologies. You know, the supply of batteries, their control of rare earth supply chains and so forth. They're the one nation that has been basically tell Trump to get lost when he tried to put pressure on them. So I'm concerned that in the United States now, you talk about possibly the disappearance of the international or global rules-based order. I'm concerned that we're eliminating the rules-based order within this country, which changes entirely the dynamics. The other thing about predicting is often we misunderstand the past. And for example, there are some fundamental differences now between the situation that the United States is in and was in, I think even as recently as just after World War II. The United States was basically uniquely invulnerable. So I'm just interested in whether you think the relationships between what is happening within the United States and then our ability to have an effective foreign policy is changing, and we're becoming less effective, and the Chinese are becoming more powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are two great questions. I'll take the first, which is about making the future versus predicting, and then whether America's, let's call it political dysfunction, for lack of a better term, is undermining our capacity to compete. You should definitely write a second memo, because I think Wells, that memo that I referred to, is kind of framed, you're right, implicitly as a reactive stance, that the United States and others are kind of reacting to world events. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. In some cases, the U.S. was being reactive when North Korea invades South Korea. In Vietnam, it's a choice, of course, about domino theory and U.S. reputation and so forth. So I totally take that point. I think it's valid. And I think it would be good to pair a Wells-style memo like the one I was kind of talking about with those major events from the 20th and 21st century. What are the big things we've been reactive to? What are the big things we've kind of driven in terms of change? And then how can we be better poised to be in the driver's seat? Because that's ultimately where you want to be. I think that's a great question. To your second, yeah, I mean, it is a little bit of a myth that there was total bipartisan consensus throughout the Cold War on the post-war order, but there was a lot more consensus than I think there is now. Having said that, I didn't get into it too much, but there is a lot of complexity, I think, when we try to understand the politics of America's global leadership role. And I'll just give you one example, and then we'll throw it open, and very happy to chat afterwards. But in the most recent National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, Congress actually stipulated a lot of money and support for NATO in ways that are contrary to what you're seeing a little bit in the administration. So it's clear, to me at least, that there's a pretty robust strain within the Republican Party still. Of course, Democrats are on board with that, in support of America's more traditional roles. And I think that push and pull that we're seeing play out right now is something we need to confront head on, especially if we're going to compete with China. Because I think both America First and the rules-based order folks agree that that's a problem, and you're surfacing how do we best do that and kind of unify. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Ahmad. My question is about this thought that the new NSS, National Security Strategy, is actually as American pie, because it breaks through this thin veneer, or at least for what many in the international community thought as a thin veneer of a rules-based international order, not just in the use of force, but even in a WTO system that since Obama, the trial process has been kind of hampered. So what are your thoughts on that?
You're hitting on something really important, which is, let's say objectively as scholars and analysts, do we think there ever really was a rules-based international order, or did the US basically do what it wants when it wants? So that's one version of a really good question. The other is, even if we kind of tell ourselves the narrative that we were adherent to the rules-based international order as Americans, did the world see us that way? And I would say on the first, the kind of scholarly, less broadly interesting, but interesting to me, of course, is that America's relationship with the rules-based order was always very complicated, and that policymakers were far more constrained than critics thought they were, but not as perfectly constrained as the proponents often articulate, because there were lots of cases where, especially during the Cold War and afterward, especially in the unipolar moment, when the United States did all sorts of things that were departures. To your point about how it's kind of changed, yeah, I think you're hitting on something which is also really important, which is to go kind of sector by sector, if you will, and you could say military force, trade, human rights, diplomacy, and see where the restraints of the rules-based order are still fairly robust and where they're kind of fraying a little bit. And I think in the trade regime, whatever consensus we had from the Cold War and for a long time, I think that's basically dead, right? Bipartisan, both Democrats and Republicans are not really defending unfettered free trade anymore. I don't think that the mainstream politicians are doing that. What that means for the rules-based international order, there's many paths. One is countries begin to disregard, including the US, these international institutions like the WTO and these broader trading regimes, or they'll get rewritten, ideally in consultation with allies and so on. But it's a big open question. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Connor. I'm a student in Boston. I'm wondering how much the U.S.'s current positions can be characterized coherently in either a, quote, America First framework or a rules-based international order framework. Because on one hand, we're very keen on involving ourselves in, I would say, made-up genocides against white people in South Africa or Christians in Nigeria. But on the other hand, we are ignoring real genocides in Sudan and Myanmar. I think just a week or so, we designated Myanmar a safe country for deportations or something. And on the other hand, we are bringing gunboat diplomacy back to the Western Hemisphere to pressure one Latin American narco president. On the other, we're pardoning another Latin American narco president because he's a good ally to the U.S. or something. I'm not sure to what extent there is one framework that can encapsulate all of that. And I was wondering if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, a kind of first is a general reaction. The second will be specific to your question. Generally, presidents have often struggled to have cohesive foreign policies, right? They really try. They want bumper stickers, especially after the Cold War. I think Bush 41 started with the New World Order. Clinton called it democratic enlargement. But each of their foreign policies and grand strategies were a little bit mixed in terms of what signals they were sending about which direction America was going. So I think that's fairly constant. Having said that, you just articulated a lot of areas where there are tensions. And I'm not going to tell you anything you don't know, but my my sense is a lot of the schisms you're seeing in the MAGA movement about military force, for example. So the strikes on Iran and some of these other global engagements, I think it's exposing that there are fissures on the right. There are fissures on the left too, of course, but Donald Trump is the president and Republicans are in power. So I think when Donald Trump was asked about whether Action X, like striking Iran's nuclear facilities, was consistent with MAGA, I think he said something close to, I invented MAGA, so it basically is what I say it is. And that's fair. It's just, your question is there a set of principles that are being cohesively and rigorously followed? And my sense is it's a lot messier than that, maybe especially now, but it often is quite messy. So this moment we're living in, I wouldn't say is unique per se on that front, whether we have a coherent foreign policy. But I do think that there are particular tensions because of what America First on paper seems to represent with this national security strategy, which is basically if it's not in America's direct interest, we're not going to do it. But Donald Trump does have an inclination to want to engage Thailand, Cambodia, India, Pakistan, Israel, and Hamas. You all will have your own judgments about where and when the United States should be doing that, and the scorecard or report card on that. I'm just saying I think there are schisms that are hard to pin down. So yes, to your question, or no, there's not I don't think a coherent policy per se.
I think before we go to the next one, I'm take some prerogative of Michael. I have a question. So if that's okay. So you mentioned even the Democrats, kind of bipartisan consensus sort of against WTO, or at least movement away from WTO, sort of that's sort of a movement towards America First in your paradigm, and sort of away from the traditional international rules-based order. Is there like a counterexample? Is there an example where sort of this administration and sort of America First broadly is embracing some core element, traditional element of the international rules-based order?
Yeah, on the first, I would say it's not that Republicans and Democrats are united in walking away from free trade entirely. I think there's just more appetite for economic populism than you've seen, in far more protectionism and a focus on manufacturing and domestic sectors. To the question of where they're going towards, to this gentleman's question, the Republican Party itself is often very reluctant to walk away in terms of funding and rhetorical support for NATO, for example, which is a huge piece of the rules-based international order, the post-war order. I think under the first Trump administration, there was a big Senate resolution that passed 90-something to single-digit no's, which like never happens in the Senate. So I think that shows you that the Senate, at least, the House is a little more rambunctious. But even then, they're willing to fund and support the Baltic Security Initiative and other elements of NATO. And President Trump is actually, I would say, complicated to read on NATO, because sometimes there are statements that are clearly not super friendly to NATO in Europe. And at other times, on the Dasha Burns podcast, he told her that NATO calls him daddy and that he has gotten them to pay 5% of GDP and is often very happy with them. So I think there's probably a lot of uncertainty, maybe in his own mind, about where he kind of comes down on NATO. But I think in terms of the rank and file on the security side, countering Russia, obviously Russia, Ukraine, the consensus on there kind of frayed a little bit as the election in 24 happened. But I think there's a lot more bipartisan consensus on security issues. For sure, there's consensus on economics away from the traditional commitments. And then some of the others, human rights institutions, are a little more complicated.
Thank you for all the questions.
Thank you. My name is Malik, and just out of curiosity, just thinking, last century, we had a major strategy in the United States, or two strategies. One, stop and destroy communism. The other one, secure the supply chains to the US at all costs. We were successful in both. Now, this century, that regardless last century or this century, all the waves and political mayhem and tactical politics that would happen, there was a strategy. So what is the strategy for us in this century that the United States is focusing on moving, regardless what some Trump, Biden, etc., those come and go. But the United States is there, and there is a strategy for this country moving forward. Could you elaborate on it, please?
Yeah, I would kind of marry the two premises of your characterization of last century. So combating communism, and let's call it securing supply chains or economic investment and access. During the Cold War, there was clear ideological competition. Capitalism, communism, that was pretty front and center for both the Soviet Union and the United States. And the Soviet Union and the United States were not particularly integrated economically. There were these blocks. The US had Western Europe and the Western Bloc, and the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and so on. Today, we have way more interdependence between the two predominant competitors in the international system, the US and China, and we don't have as much of an ideological tinge to that competition. The Biden administration did try to put forward a kind of democracy versus authoritarianism, but authoritarianism is a political system, not an ideology, or it's a principle. But it's not clear that China is necessarily as ideological as the Soviet Union was. I mean, they certainly export their authoritarian system, and the Belt and Road Initiative certainly puts countries in a dependent situation that makes them vulnerable to Chinese influence. But you lack that ideological dimension, and we're super interdependent with China. And I think you're seeing this with chips, you're seeing this with critical minerals and rare earths. And so I would just say, yes, they are. This is a huge challenge for the Biden administration. It's a big challenge for the Trump administration. And it's probably way harder than it was in the Cold War because it's less intelligible to people where you have communism and capitalism. It's this global economy where China itself is a kind of quasi-capitalist, socialist, authoritarian country. And these supply chains are so interconnected. And in the case of like rare earths, I'm about to exceed my knowledge here, but my understanding is it's not that the United States doesn't have access, it's processing and things like that are actually quite challenging. And China and other countries do that, more cheaply, and they're not as concerned about some of the societal ramifications. So I think the absence of a galvanizing ideology makes it a little hard for the Americans who don't pay much attention to foreign policy to care, but the problem is much thornier than it was in the Cold War, even though the impulse is there.
My name is Raul Alcalá, and I'd like you to comment on two concepts based on your examples. One is the concept of the difference between de jure and de facto, and the other is the difference between just in time and just in case. All of our national security documents, since they were mandated by Congress and each administration has put out this document every 4 years or so, have been aspirational documents, not documents de facto of what the U.S. is able to do, but rather what it would strive to do. And in your assessment of the current situation, where do we stand? Because a lot of the palaver has to do with the assumption that something is in fact in being, that it de facto exists, that it's just in case available rather than might be produced just in time. Armies, navies, trade routes, you name it.
It is unequivocally true that most national security strategies are ambitious wish lists of hodgepodge kind of pet projects of people. That's not a charitable interpretation of strategies, but that is essentially what they are. They don't necessarily articulate a core guiding principle. That is kind of different. This national security strategy, although it's gotten a lot of buzz, it does articulate maybe a clearer vision than previous ones, which were a little harder to articulate. So certainly not just in the national security strategy, but you kind of pointed to military strategy. We were talking backstage during the Cold War, we had this military strategy or force planning strategy of what we call a 2.5 war strategy. I'm going to bore Sarah, even Ryan here, but it was basically the idea we could fight the Soviet Union, China, and a half war if we had to, and then we had a 1.5 war strategy and so on. When Nixon and Kissinger, so this is like late 1960s, when they moved to the 1.5 war strategy, Kissinger basically said the 2.5 war strategy was always fiction. It was a myth. We could never do that. And the amount of resources the United States, for example, deployed to Vietnam, which would have probably fallen in the half war categories, like 500,000 troops, personnel. It was a lot of resources. And the notion that the United States could fight the Soviet Union and China was always quite aspirational. Now, I'm not going to go down this road too much just because it's off topic, not because it's not important. The way the U.S. often squared that circle was nuclear deterrence. So if we can't beat an adversary conventionally with our Navy or our Army or Air Force, we might have to turn to nuclear deterrence. And then the whole question is, how do you make that credible? But I would say this ends, the aspirations, ends and means, either in the national security strategy or the military strategy, there's often a big delta between those two. And how big that delta is kind of depends on the geopolitical situation and what Congress is willing to fund, but it's a perennial issue. And I guess then the question is it better or worse to have aspirational documents that we're not meeting, or to be realistic, which might have a much smaller ambition or vision for what America's role should be? My impression, including of current administration and previous, back to the end of World War II, is that they preferred a more ambitious strategy, and they would kind of figure out how to try to get the resources or hold at bay threats that might have undermined those strategies. But it's a fair critique, I think, of national security and military strategies.
Hi, my name is Christopher Wagstaff. I was trying to find the memo, the decade by decade one, to see if Spanish flu was mentioned. I noticed that you missed COVID. Perhaps, do you think that that will have lasting impacts on international relations, or will the effects kind of fade? Because at the moment it felt really big, but I mean, what from Spanish influenza affected last century?
Yeah, I thought about that, but I had printed it already, and it was too late. If I'm being just a little peel behind the curtain. I thought about COVID and Spanish flu. I mean, this is happening around World War I. It's a huge deal. In the United States, I don't know. I would say internationally, it's really hard to know what to make of COVID, because I think COVID in the United States became so polarized. It kind of became a signal of which party one was in, if you were kind of thought it was predominantly overblown, or whether one thought it was really serious. It didn't start out that way. So I don't know, because things like global health, pandemics, these really important phenomena are not always, they don't always make it into the strategies and memos of people in the Pentagon or even necessarily the State Department, but they're hugely important. And so I think in addition to this driving the future, we should probably do a security memo, a public health memo. A lot of things happened in the 20th century and 21st century in public health that were hugely consequential. And by the way, this is not exactly where you were going, I think, but it's related to your question. Part of what is essential to competing in the international system is not just the strongest military and the largest nuclear arsenal, although that helps, but it's also a vibrant economy. It's a healthy population. And so I think that was a big challenge for China, for example. So the geopolitical implications of China's zero COVID policy, I think really, I'm a little bit outside of my lane here, but I think it had a huge toll on China's economy. And how different countries handle pandemics and other extreme weather and other crises like that, they're a little bit harder to quantify in terms of the types of things I was kind of mentioning tonight, but are obviously hugely important. So I'm really glad you raised it, and I hope the global health people and the national security people can talk to each other a little bit more, because there's a lot of cooperation and collaboration that needs to happen for us to get it right. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, please give it up for Michael.